Brida, the international bestseller book written by Paulo Coelho. Part 2. On Saturday morning, Lawrence phoned. "Let us go for a walk along the cliffs," he said. Brida prepared something to eat, and together they entered the long journey in an inadequately heated bus. They reached the village at around midday. Brida felt excited. In her first year as a student of literature at the university, she had read a lot about the poet who had lived there. He was a mysterious man who knew a great deal about the tradition of the moon. He had been a member of secret societies and left in his books a hidden message for those who seek the spiritual path. His name was W.B. Yeats. She remembered two particular lines by him, which seemed just made for that cold morning, with the seagulls flying over the boats anchored in the little harbor. "I have spread my dreams under your feet. Tread softly, because you tread on my dreams." They went into the only pub in the village, drank a whiskey to keep out the cold, and then set off. The little tarmac road gave away to a steep climb, and half an hour later they reached what the local called the cliffs. This was a promontory made of rocky outcrops that dropped sheer into the sea. There was a path to follow, and even at a leisurely pace, they would be able to do the whole walk in less than 4 hours and still catch the bus back to Dublin. Brida was delighted at the prospect, regardless of what emotions life might be holding in reserve for her that year. She always found the winter hard to bear. All she did was go to work during the day, to the university in the evening, and to the cinema at weekends. She dutifully performed the rituals and dance Wicca had together her. But she had a yearning to be out in the world, to see a little nature. It was overcast and the clouds were very low, but the physical exercise and the whiskey helped fend off the cold. The path was too narrow for them to walk along side by side. Lawrence went ahead and Brida followed a little way behind. It was hard to talk in these circumstances. Nevertheless, they managed to exchange a few words, even for them to feel each other close and to enjoy the nature around them. She was gazing with childlike fascination at the landscape. It must have been exactly the same thousands of years ago, in an age when there were no towns, no harbors, no poets, no young women seeking the tradition of the moon, when there were only the rocks, the crashing waves, and the seagulls drifting about beneath the low clouds. Now and then, Brida peered over the precipice and felt slightly dizzy. The sea was saying things that she couldn't understand. The seagulls were making patterns she couldn't follow, and yet she was looking at that primitive world as if the true wisdom of the universe lay there rather than in any of books she would read or in any of the rituals she practiced. As they moved away from the harbor, everything else gradually diminished in importance. Her dreams, her daily life, her search. There was only what Wicca called God's signature. All that remained was that primitive moment among the pure force of nature, the sense of being alive and in the company of someone she loved. After nearly 2 hours of walking, the path suddenly grew wider and they decided to sit down together to rest. They couldn't stop for long. The cold would soon become unbearable and they would have to move on. But she felt like spending at least a few minutes by his side, looking up at the clouds and listening to the sound of the sea. Brida could smell the sea air and was aware of the taste of salt in her mouth. She warmed her face against Laurence's jacket. It was a moment of great plenitude. All five of her senses were working. Yes, all five of her senses were working. For a fraction of a second, the thought of the magus entered her mind and then vanished. All she cared about now were those five senses. They must keep working. This was the moment. I need to talk to you, Lawrence. Lawrence murmured something or other, but his heart was afraid as he looked up at the clouds or down at the precipice. He realized that this woman was the most important thing in his life, that she was the explanation, the sole reason for the existence of those rocks, that sky, that winter. If she were not there with him, it wouldn't matter. If all the angels of heaven came flying down to comfort him, paradise would make no sense. I want to tell you that I love you, Brida said softly, because you have shown me the joy of love. She felt full, complete, as if the whole landscape were seeping into her soul. He began stroking her hair, and she was sure that if she took a risk, she would experience love as never before. Brida kissed him. She felt the taste of his mouth, the touch of his tongue. She was aware of every moment and sensed that he was feeling exactly the same, because the tradition of sun always reveals itself to those who look at the world as if they were seeing it for the first time. I want to make love with you right here, Lawrence. Various thoughts flashed through his mind. They were on a public footpath. Someone might come by, some other person crazy enough to visit this place in the middle of winter. But anyone crazy enough to do so would also be able to understand that certain forces, once set in motion, cannot be interrupted. He slipped his hands under her sweater and stroked her breasts. Brida surrendered herself entirely. The force of the world were penetrating her five senses, and these were becoming transformed into an overwhelming energy. They lay down on the ground between the rock, the precipice, and the sea, between the life of the seagulls flying up above and the death of the stones beneath. And they began fearlessly to make love, because God protects the innocent. They no longer felt the cold. Their blood was flowing so fast in their veins that she tore off some of her clothes, and so did he. There was no more pain. Knees and back were pressed into the stony ground, but that became part of this pleasure, completing it. Brida knew that she was close to orgasm, but it was still a very remote feeling, because she was entirely connected to the world. Her body and Lawrence's body mingled with the sea and the stones, with life and death. She remained in that state for as long as possible, while some part of her was vaguely conscious that she was doing things she had never done before. What she was feeling, though, was the bringing together once more of herself and the meaning of life. It was a return to the Garden of Eden. It was the moment when Eve was reabsorbed into Adam's body and the two halves became creation. At last she could no longer control the world around her. Her five senses seemed to break free, and she wasn't strong enough to hold on to them. As if struck by a sacred bolt of lightning, she unleashed them, and the world, the seagull, the taste of salt, the hard earth, the smell of the sea, the clouds all disappeared, and in their place appeared a vast golden light, which grew and grew until it touched the most distant star in the galaxy. She gradually came down from the stage, and the sea and the clouds reappeared, but everything was filled by a sense of profound peace, the peace of a universe which became, if only for a matter of moment, explicable because she was in communion with the world. She had discovered another bridge that joined the visible to the invisible, and she would never again forget the path that led to it. The following day, she phoned Vika and told her what had happened. For a while, Vika said nothing. Congratulations, she said at last. You have made it. She explained that from then on, the power of sex would bring about profound changes in the way Brida saw and experienced the world. You are ready now for the celebration of the equinox. There is just one more thing. One more thing? But you said that was it. It is quite easy. You simply have to dream of a dress, the dress you will wear on the day. And that if I cannot, you will. You have done the most difficult part. And then, as so often, she changed the subject. She told Brida that she would brought a new car and needed to do some shopping. Would Brida like to go with her? Brida was proud to be invited and asked her boss if she could leave work early. It was the first time Vika had shown her and any kind of affection, even if it was only an invention to join her on a shopping trip. She knew that many of Vika's other students were loved to be in her shoes. Perhaps that afternoon would provide her with a chance to show Vika how important she was to her and how much she wanted to be her friend. It was difficult for Brida to separate friendship from the spiritual search, and she was hurt because until then her teacher had never shown the slightest interest in her private life. Their conversations never went beyond that Brida needed to know in order to work within the tradition of the moon. At the appointed hour, Vika was waiting outside in a red MG convertible with the top down. The car, a British classic, was exceptionally well preserved with gleaming bodywork and a polished wooden dashboard. Brida didn't even dare hazard a guess at how much it must have cost. The idea that a witch should own such an expensive car frightened her a little. Before she would known anything about the tradition of the moon, she would heard all kinds of tales in her childhood about witches making terrible pacts with the devil in exchange for money and power. Isn't it a bit cold to drive with the top down? She asked as she got in. I can't wait until summer, Vika said. I just can't. I have been aching to go for a drive like this for ages. That was good, at least in this respect. She was like any other normal person. They drove through the street, receiving admiring glances from old passers-by and a few wolf whistles and compliment from men. It is a good sign that you are worried about not being able to dream about the dress, said Vika. Brida, however, had already forgotten about their phone conversation. Never stop having doubts. If you ever do, it will be because you have stopped moving forward. And at that point, God will step in and pull the rug from under your feet, because that is His way of controlling His chosen ones, by making sure they always follow their appointed path to the end. If for any reason we stop, whether out of complacency, laziness, or out of a mistaken belief that we know enough, he forced us on. On the other hand, you must be careful never to allow doubt to paralyze you. Always take the decisions you need to take, even if you are not sure you are doing the right thing. You will never go wrong if, when you make a decision, you keep in mind an old German proverb that the tradition of the moon has adopted. The devil is in the detail. Remember that proverb, and you will always be able to turn a wrong decision into a right one. Vika suddenly stopped outside a garage. There is a superstition connected to that proverb too, she said. It only comes to our aid when we need it. I have just brought this car, and the devil is in that detail. She got out as soon as a mechanic came over her. Is the hood broken, madam? Vika didn't even answer. She asked him to check the car over for her, and while he was working, the two women sat and drank hot chocolate in a cafe over the way. Watch what the mechanic does, Vika said, looking across at the garage. He had the bonnet open and was standing, staring at the engine, not even moving. He is not touching anything. He is just looking. He has done this job for years, and he knows that the car speaks to him in a special language. It is not his reason that is working now. It is his intuition. Suddenly the mechanic went straight to one particular part of the engine and starting fiddling with it. He's found the fault, Vika went on. He didn't waste a moment because between him and the car there is perfect communication. Every good mechanic I have ever known has been the same. So have the mechanics I have known, thought Brida. But she did always assumed they behaved that way because they didn't know where to start. She did never noticed that they always started in the right place. If they have the wisdom of the sun in their lives, they try to understand the fundamental question of the universe. Why do they prefer to fix car or work in a bar serving coffee? And what make you think that we, but our path and our dedication, understand the universe by better than other people? I have many students. They are all perfectly ordinary people who cry at the movie and worry if their children are late home, even though they know that death is not the end. Witchcraft is merely one way of being close to the supreme wisdom, but anything you do can lead you there, as long as you work with love in your heart. We witches can converse with the soul of the world, is the point of light above the left shoulder of our soulmate, and contemplate the infinite through the glow and silence of a candle. But we don't understand car engines. Mechanics need us as much as we need them. They find their bridge across to the invisible in a car engine, while we find ours in the tradition of the moon, but the bridge connected to the same invisible world. Play your part and don't worry about what others do. Believe that God also speaks to them, and that they are as engaged as you are in discovering the meaning of life. The car's fine, said the mechanic when they went back to the garage, apart from a hose that was about to burst and that could have caused you serious problems. Vika haggled a little over the price, but she was very glad that she did remember the proverb. They went to one of Dublin's main shopping street, which also happened to be the location of the shop that Brida had once had to visualize as part of an exercise. Whenever the conversation turned to personal topic, Vika would respond vaguely and evasively, but she spoke with great words about trivial matters, prices, clothes, road shop assistants. Everything she brought that afternoon revealed sophistication and good taste. Brida knew that it wasn't the done thing to ask someone where she got her money, but so great was her curiosity that she came very close to violating that most elementary rule of politeness. They ended up in a Japanese restaurant with a dish of sashimi before them. May God bless our food, said Vika. We are all sailors on an unknown sea. May He make us brave enough to accept this mystery. But you are a teacher of tradition of moon, said Brida. You know the answers. Vika sat for a moment, absorbed, looking at the food. Then she said, I know how to travel between the present and the past. I know the world of the spirits, and I have communed with forces so amazing that no words in any language could describe them. I could perhaps say that I possess the silent knowledge of the journey that has brought the human race to where it is at this moment. But because I know all this and because I am a teacher, I also know that we will never ever know the ultimate reason for our existence. We might know the how, where, then of being here. But why will always be a question that remains unanswered. The main objective of the great architect of the universe is known to him alone and to no one else. A silence fell. Right now, while we are here eating, 99% of the people on this planet are in their own way, struggling with that very question. Why are we here? Many think they have found the answer in religion or in materialism. Others despair and spend their lives and their money trying to grasp the meaning of it all. If you let the question go unanswered and live for the moment, regardless of the result or the consequences, only the brave and those who understand the tradition of sun and the moon are aware that the only possible answer to the question is, I don't know. This might at first seem frightening, leaving us terribly vulnerable in our dealings with the world, with the thing of the world, and with our own sense of our existence. Once we have got over that initial fear, however, we gradually become accustomed to the only possible solution to follow our dreams. Having the courage to take the steps we always wanted to take is the only way of showing that we trust in God. As soon as we accept this, life takes on a sacred meaning and we experience the same emotion the Virgin must have felt when, one afternoon in her otherwise very ordinary existence, a stranger appeared to her and made her an offer. Be it unto be according to thy word, said the Virgin, because she had understood that the greatest thing a human being can do is to accept the mystery. After another long silence, Vika again took up her knife and fork and resumed her meal. Brida looked at her, proud to be by her side. She wasn't bothered now by the question she would never ask about how Vika earned her money, or if she was in love with someone or jealous of someone else. She thought about the greatness of soul of the true sages, sages who had spent their entire life searching for an answer that did not exist, but who were not tempted to invent an answer when they realized there was none. Instead, they carried on humbly inhabiting a universe they would never understand. The only way they could truly participate was by following their own desires, their own dreams, because that is how men become an instrument of God. So, what is the point of looking for an answer then? We don't look for an answer, we accept it, and then life becomes much more intense, much more brilliant, because we understand that each minute, each step that we take has a meaning that goes far beyond us as individuals. We realized that somewhere in time and space each question does have an answer. We realized that there is a reason for us being here, and for us what is enough. We plunge into the dark night with faith. We fulfill what the ancient alchemists used to call our personal legend, and we surrender ourselves fully to each moment, knowing that there is always a hand to guide us, and whether we accept it or not is entirely upon us. That night, Brida spent hours listening to music, entirely given over the miracle of being alive. She thought about her favorite authors. One of them, the English poet William Blake, had with just one simple phrase given her enough faith to go in search of wisdom. What is now proved was once only imagined. It was time to perform one of her rituals. She would spend the next few minutes contemplating a candle flame, and to do so, she sat down before the little altar. The process of contemplation took her back to the afternoon when she and Lawrence had made love among the rocks. There were seagulls flying as high as the cloud and as low as the waves. The fish must have asked themselves how they managed to fly. These mysterious creatures who plunged into their world, then left as quickly as they entered. The birds must have asked themselves how the creatures they fed on and that lived beneath the waves could possibly manage to breathe underwater. Birds existed and fish existed. Theirs were universes that occasionally collided, but they could not answer each other's questions, and yet both had questions, and the questions had answers. Brida looked at the flame before her, and a magical atmosphere began to grow around her. This was what normally happened, but that night the feeling was more intense. If she were capable of asking a question, it was because in another universe there was an answer. Someone knew it. Even if she didn't need to understand the meaning of life. It was enough to find someone who did, and then fall asleep in his arms and sleep as a child sleeps, knowing that someone stronger than you is protecting you from all evil and all danger. When the ritual was over, she said a little prayer in gratitude for the steps she had so far taken. She was grateful because the first person she had asked about magic hadn't tried to explain the universe to her. Instead, he had made her spend the whole night in a dark forest. She needed to go there and thank him for all he had taught her. Whenever she went in search of that man, she was looking for something. Whenever she found that something, all she did was leave, often without even saying goodbye. But he had shown her the door through which she hoped to pass at the next equinox. She should at least say thank you. No, she wasn't afraid of falling in love with him. She had read things in Lauren's eyes about the hidden side of her own soul, and while she might have her doubts about being able to dream of a dress, as regards his love, about that she was perfectly clear. "Thank you for accepting my invitation," she said to Magus when they sat down. They were sitting in the only pub in the village, which is where she had first noticed the strange light in his eyes. The Magus said nothing. He noticed that her energy was quite different now. She had clearly managed to awaken the force. "On the night you left me alone in the forest, I promised that I would come back, either to thank you or to curse you. I promised that I would come back when I found my path, but I didn't keep either of those promises. I always came in search of help, and you never let me down. It may be presumptuous of me, but I want you to know that you have acted as God's instrument, and I would like you to be my guest tonight." Just as she was about to order 2 whiskies, he got up, went over to the bar and returned carrying 2 bottles, one of wine and one of mineral water, and 2 glasses. "In ancient Persia," he said, "when 2 people met to drink together, one of them was chosen to be king of the night, usually the person who was paying. He didn't know if his voice sounded sufficiently steady. He was a man in love, and Brida's energy had changed. He placed the wine and the mineral water before her. It was up to the king of the night to set to the tone of the conversation. If he poured more water than wine into the first glass to be drunk, then meant he wished to speak of serious things. If he poured equal quantities of both, they would speak of both serious and pleasant things. Finally, if he filled the glass with wine and added only a few drops of water, the night would be relaxing and enjoyable." Brida filled the glasses to the brim with wine and added only a drop of water to each. "I came to say thank you," she said again, "for teaching me that life is an act of faith, and that I am worthy of the search. That has helped me enormously on the path I have chosen." They both drained that first glass quickly. He because he was feeling tense, she because she was feeling relaxed. "Only light subjects, all right," Brida said. The Magus said that since she was the king of the night, it was up to her to decide what they should talk about. "I want to know a little about your personal life. I want to know if you ever had an affair with Vika." He nodded. Brida felt an inexplicable tremor of jealousy, but she wasn't sure whether she felt jealous of him or of Vika. "But we never considered living together," he said. They both knew the 2 traditions. They both knew that they were not each other's soulmate. "I didn't want to learn how to see the point of light," thought Brida, but she saw now that this was inevitable. That was what love between witches was like. She drank a little more. She was getting closer to her objective. It would not be long now until the spring equinox, and she could afford to relax. It had been a long time since she had allowed herself to drink more than she should, but now all she had to do was dream of a dress. They continued talking and drinking. Brida wanted to return to the subject of Vika, but she needed him to be more relaxed too. She kept both their glasses filled and they finished the first bottle while in the middle of the conversation about the difficulties of living in such a small village. The locals associated the magus with the devil. Brida, pleased to feel important to him. He must be very lonely. Maybe no one in the village ever addressed more than a few polite words to him. They opened another bottle, and she was surprised to see that a magus, a man who spent all day in the forest seeking communion with God, was also capable of drinking and getting drunk. By the time they had finished the second bottle, she had forgotten that she was there in order to thank the man sitting opposite her. Her relationship with him, she realized now, had always been a veiled challenge. She didn't want to see him as an ordinary person, but she was getting dangerously close to doing just that. She preferred the image of the wise man who had led her to a cabin high up in the trees and who often spent hours contemplating the sunset. She began to talk about Vika to see how he reacted. She said what an excellent teacher she was and how she had taught her everything she needed to know so far, but in such a subtle way that it was if she would always known the things she was learning. But you have, said Magus, that is the traditional son. He is obviously not going to admit that Vika is a good teacher, thought Brida. She drank another glass of wine and continued to talk about her teacher, but Magus made no further comment. Tell me about you and her, she said, to see if she could provoke him. She didn't want to know. She really didn't, but it was the best way to get a reaction. A seas of young love. We were part of a generation that knew no limits. The generation of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. She was surprised to hear this. Far from relaxing her, the wine was making her tense. She still wanted to ask these questions, but now she realized that she wasn't happy with the answers. That was when we met, he went on, unaware of her feelings. We were both seeking our respective path, and they crossed when we happened to go to the same teacher. Together, we learnt about the tradition of the sun and the tradition of the moon, and both, in our own fashion, became teachers. Brida decided to pursue the subject. 2 bottles of wine can make complete strangers feel as if they have been friends from childhood. Wine gives people courage. Why did you split up? It was Mag's turn to order another bottle. She noticed this and grew even more tense. She would hate to find out that he was still in love with Vika. We split up when we learned about soulmates. If you hadn't found out about those points of light or the special light in your soulmate's eyes, would you still be together? I don't know. I only know that if we were, it wouldn't work for either of us. We only understand life and the universe when we find our soulmate. Brida paused for a moment, suddenly lost for words. It was the Magus who took up the conversation. Let us go, he said, after taking only a sip of the wine from that third bottle. I need to feel the wind and the cold air on my face. He is getting drunk, she thought, and he is afraid. She felt proud of herself. She could take her drunk better than he could. And she wasn't in the least afraid of losing control. She had come out that night intending to enjoy herself. Just a little more. After all, I am the king of the night. The magus drank another glass, but he knew he had reached his limit. You haven't asked me anything about myself, she said challengingly. Aren't you curious, or can you use your power to see right through me? For a fraction of a second, she felt she had gone too far, but then she dismissed the thought. She merely noticed a change in the magus' eyes. There was a completely different light in them now. Something in Brida seemed to open, or rather, she had the sense of a wall coming down. A feeling that, from then on, everything would be permitted. She remembered the last time they had been together, her desire to stay with him, and his coldness. Now she understood that she hadn't gone there that night in order to thank him, but to see revenge, to tell him that she did discovered the force with another man, a man she loved. Why do I need revenge? Why am I angry with him? She wondered, but the wine wouldn't allow her to answer those questions coherently. The magus was looked at young woman opposite him, and the desire to demonstrate his power kept coming and going in his mind. On a night very like this, many years ago, his whole life had changed. It might have been the age of Beatles and Rolling Stones, but there were also people around at the time in search of unknown forces, forces they didn't even believe in. They made use of magical powers, all the while thinking that they were stronger than the powers themselves, convinced that they would be able to leave the tradition as soon as boredom set in. He had been one of those people. He had entered the sacred world through the tradition of moon, learning rituals and crossing the bridge that connected the visible and the invisible. At first, he dabbled in these powers in his own, learning from books with no help from anyone. Then he met his teacher. At their first meeting, his teacher told him that he would be better off learning through the tradition of sun, but the magus didn't want that. The tradition of moon was more interesting, it involving performing ancient rituals and learning the wisdom of time. And so his teacher taught him the tradition of the moon, saying that perhaps this was the path that would eventually lead him the tradition of sun. At the time he was utterly sure of himself, of life, and of his conquests. The brilliant career lay ahead of him, and he intended using tradition of the moon to achieve his goals. In order to do so, witchcraft demanded that he first become a teacher, and that he never infringe the one limitation placed on all teachers of the tradition of moon, never to interfere with another person's free will. He could forge his own path in the world by using his magical knowledge, but he couldn't get rid of someone simply because they were in his way, nor could we force them to follow him on his path. That was one prohibition, the only tree of whose fruit he must not eat. And everything went smoothly until he fell in love with one of his teacher's other students, and she fell in love with him. Both knew the traditions. He knew that he was not her man, and she knew that she was not his woman. Nevertheless, they surrendered to their love, leaving life in a charge of separating them when the time came. Far from diminishing their passion, this only made them live each moment as if it were their last, and the love between them had all the intensity of things that take on an eternal quality precisely because they are going to die. Then one day she met another man. This man knew nothing of the traditions, nor did he have a point of light above his left shoulder or the special light in his eyes that reveals someone to be your soulmate. Love, however, is no respecter of reasons, and she fell in love as far as she was concerned. Her time with the magus had come to an end. They quarreled and fought. He begged and implored. He subjected himself to all the usual humiliation endured by people in love. He learned things he never dreamed he would learn: hope, fear, acceptance. He doesn't have the point of light above his left shoulder. He argued. You told me that yourself, but she didn't care. Before she did finally meet her soulmate, she wanted to know other men, to experience the world. The magus set a limit on his pain. When he reached it, he would forget all about her for a reason he could now no longer remember. He did reach that limit, but instead of forgetting her, he discovered that his teacher was right. Emotions were like wild horses, and it requires wisdom to be able to control them. His passion was stronger than all his years of studying the tradition of moon, stronger than all the mind control technique he had learned, stronger than the rigid discipline to which he would had to submit in order to get where he was. Passion was a blind force, and it kept whispering in his ear that he must not lose that woman. He could do nothing against her. She was a teacher like him, and she had learnt her trade over many incarnations, some filled with fame and glory, others marked by fire and suffering. She would know how to defend herself. However, there was a third party involved in this furious struggle, a man caught in destiny's mysterious web, a web that neither Maggie nor witches can understand. An ordinary man, perhaps, as in love with that woman as he was, a man who wanted her to happy and to do his best for her. An ordinary man whom Providence's mysterious designs had thrown into the middle of his battle between a man and a woman who know the tradition of moon. One night, when he could stand the pain no longer, he ate of the forbidden fruit, using the power and knowledge that the wisdom of time had taught him. He removed that man from the woman he loved. He did not know to this day whether or not she ever found out, but it may well be that she had already grown tired of her new conquest and didn't much mind him leaving. However, his teacher knew. His teacher always knew everything, and the tradition of moon was implacable with those initiates who used black magic, especially to influence that most important and most vulnerable of human emotions, love. When he confronted his teacher, he understood that the screwed vow he had made was impossible to break. He understood that the force he thought he could control and use were far more powerful than he was. He understood that he was on his chosen path, but that it was not a path like any other, and he understood that in this incarnation he could never leave that path. Now that he had erred, he had to pay a price, and the price was to drink that cruelest of poisons, loneliness, until love felt that he had once more been transformed into a teacher. Then the same love that he had wounded would set him free again and finally reveal his soulmate to him. You haven't asked me anything about myself. Aren't you curious? Or can you use your powers to see right through me? His past took no more than a second to flash through his mind, just long enough for him to decide whether to allow things to happen as they would in the tradition of sun, or to speak to her about the point of light that thus interfere in fate. Brida wanted to be a witch, but she hadn't yet achieved that ambition. He remembered the cabin high up in the tree when he had come very close to telling her. Now he was tempted again because, having lowered his guard, he had forgotten that the devil is in the detail. We are all masters of our own destiny. We can so easily make the same mistakes over and over. We can so easily flee from everything that we desire and which life so generously placed before us. Alternatively, we can surrender ourselves to divine providence, take God's hand, and fight for our dreams, believing that they always arrive at the right moment. Let us go, said the magus, and Brida could see that this time he was serious. She made a point of paying the bill. After all, she was the king of the night. They put on their coats and went out into the cold, which was now less bitter. In a matter of weeks, it would be spring. They walked together to the bus station. A bus was due to leave in a few minutes. Out in the cold, Brida's feeling of irritation were replaced by a terrible confusion, which she could not explain. She didn't want to get on that bus. Everything was wrong. It seemed to her that she had entirely failed to achieve her main objective of the evening, that she needed to put everything right before she left. She had come there to thank him, and yet she was behaving just as she had on the previous two occasions. She didn't get on the bus, saying that she felt sick. 50 minutes passed and another bus arrived. I don't want to leave, she said, not because I drank too much and fell ill, but because I have spoiled everything. I haven't thanked you as I should have. This is the last bus, said the magus. I will get a taxi later, even if it is expensive. When the bus left, Brida regretted not get on it. She was confused. She had no idea what she wanted. I am drunk, she thought, and said, let us go for a walk. I need to sober up. They strolled through the empty village with the street lamps lit and all the windows dark. It is just not possible. I saw the light in Lauren's eye, and yet I want to stay here with this man. She was just an ordinary, fickle woman, unworthy of all that she had learned and experienced through witchcraft. She was ashamed of herself. All it took was a few glasses of wine, and Lawrence, her soulmate, and everything she would learned in the tradition of moon were suddenly of no importance. She wondered briefly if she would been wrong. Perhaps the light in Lawrence's eyes was in the light of spoken of tradition of sun. But no, she was merely fooling herself. No one can fail to recognize the light in the eyes of their soulmate. If she were to meet Lawrence in a crowded theatre without ever having spoken to him before, the moment their eyes met, she would know for sure that he was the man for her. She would find a way of approaching him, and he would welcome her approaches, because the traditions are never wrong. Soulmates always find each other in the end. Long before she knew anything about soulmate, she had often heard people speak about that inexplicable phenomenon, love at first sight. Any human being could recognize that light without any need for magical powers. She had known about it before she knew of its existence. She had been it, for example, in the Magus' eyes the first time they went to the pub together. She stopped. I am drunk. She thought again. She must simply forget all about it. She needed to count her money to see if she had enough for a taxi fare back. That was important. But she had seen the light in Magus' eyes, the light that showed he was her soulmate. You are very pale, said Magus. You must have drunk too much. It will pass. Let us sit down for a while until it does. Then I will go home. They sat on the bench while she fumbled around in her bag in search of money. She could stand up, find a taxi, and leave forever. She had a teacher, and she knew how to continue her path. She knew her soulmate too. If she decided to get up now and leave, she would still be fulfilling the mission God had set her. She might only be 21, but she already knew it was possible to encounter two soulmates in the same incarnation, and that the result was bounded to be pain and suffering. How could she avoid that? I am not going home, she said. I am staying here. The Magus' eyes shone, and what had been only a hope became an eternity. They continued walking. The Magus watches Brida's aura change color many times and hoped she was taking the right path. He understood the storm and earthquakes shaking the soul of his soulmate, but knew that this was in the nature of transformation. That is how the earth and the stars and mankind are transformed. They left the village and were walking out into the countryside towards the mountains where they always met. When Brida asked him to stop, let us go this way, she said, turning down a path that led into a wheat field, although why she didn't know. She simply felt a sudden need to feel the force of nature and the friendly spirits who, ever since the world was created, have inhabited all the lovely places of the planet. A huge moon was shining in the sky, illuminating the path and the countryside around. Without a word, Magus followed. Deep in his heart, he thanked God for having believed that, for not allowing him to make the same mistake again, as he had been on the point of doing just a minute before his prayers were answered. They walked through the wheat field, which was transformed by the moonlight into a silver sea. Brida was walking aimlessly, with no idea what she next step would be. A voice inside her was telling her that she should go forward, that she was just as strong as her forebears, and that there was no need to worry because they were there guiding her steps and protecting her with the wisdom of time. They stopped in the middle of the field. They were surrounded by mountains, and on one of those mountains was a rock from which one could get a fine view of the sunset. There was a hunter's cabin too, higher up than all the others, and a place where one night a young woman had confronted fear and darkness. I am ready, she thought to herself. I am ready, and I know I am protected. She conjured up the image of the candle at home always burning, her seal with the tradition of the moon. Here is a good place, she said, stopping. She picked up a twig and traced a large circle in the earth while she recited the sacred name her teacher had taught her. She didn't have her ritual dagger with her. She had none of her sacred objects, but her ancestors were there, and they were telling her that in order not to be burned at the stake, they had consecrated their kitchen utensils. Everything in this world is sacred. She said that twig was sacred. Yes, responded Magus. Everything in this world is sacred, and a grain of sand can be a bridge to the invisible. At this moment, though, the bridge to the invisible is my soulmate, Brida said. His eyes filled with tears. God was just. The two of them entered the circle and she ritually closed it. This was the protective gestures that Maggie and witches had used since time immemorial. You were generous enough to show me your world, said Brida. I perform this ritual now to show that I belong to that world. She raised her arms to the moon and invoked the magical force of nature. She had often seen her teacher do this when they went to the wood, but now she was doing it, confident that nothing would go wrong. The forces were telling her that she did not need to learn anything. She had only to remember the many times she had done this in her many lives as a witch. She prayed then that she harvest would be good and that the field which always be fertile. There she was, the priestess who in other ages had brought together the earth's knowledge and the transformation of the seed, and had prayed while her man was working the land. The Magus let Brida take the initial steps. He knew that at a certain point he would have to take control, but he needed to leave recorded on space and time the fact that she had begun to process. His teacher, who at that moment was wandering some astral plane, awaiting his next life, was there in that field of wheat, just as he had been there in the pub during his last temptation, and he was doubtless happy that his student had learned from his suffering. The Magus listened in silence to Brida's invocations. When she stopped, she said, I don't know why I have done all this, but I know I have done my part. I will continue, he said. Then he turned to the north and imitated the cries of birds that existed now only in myths and legends. That was the only detail that had been lacking. Vika was a good teacher and had taught Brida almost everything, apart from the ending, when the sound of the sacred pelican and the phoenix had been invoked. The whole circle filled with light, a mysterious light which illuminated nothing around it, but which was nonetheless a light. The Magus looked at his soulmate, and there she was, resplendent in her eternal body, with a golden aura and filaments of light emerging from her navel and her head. He knew that she was seeing the same thing, as well as the point of light above his left shoulder, slightly blurred, perhaps because of the wine they would drink earlier. My soulmate, she said softly when she saw the point of light, I am going to walk with you through the tradition of the moon, said the Magus, and at once the wheat field around them became a grey desert in which there was a temple with a woman, all in white, dancing before the temple's vast door. Brida and Magus were watching this from high up on a dune, and she didn't know if the people could see her. She felt the Magus' presence beside her and wanted to ask him what the vision meant. But she could not speak. He saw the fear in her eyes, and they returned to the circle of light in the wheat field. What was that? She asked. A present from me to you. That is one of the 11 secret temples of the tradition of the moon. A gift of love and gratitude for the fact that you exist, and because I have waited so long to find you. Take me with you, she said. Show me how to walk through your world. And together they traveled through time and space, through the two traditions. Brida saw meadows full of flowers, animals she had only read about in books, mysterious castles and cities that seemed to float on clouds of light. The sky lit up as the Magus drew for her above the wheat field the sacred symbols of the tradition. At one point they appeared to be in the icy landscape of one of Earth's two poles, but it was not our planet. Other smallest creatures with long fingers and strange eyes were working on a vast spaceship. Whenever she was about to say something to him, the images would vanish to be replaced by others. Brida understood with her woman's soul that the man by her side was trying to show her everything he had learned over the years, and that he must have been waiting all this time simply to present her with this gift. He could give himself to her now without fear, because she was his soulmate. She could travel with him through the Elysian fields where the enlightened souls live, and which are visited now and then by other souls still in search of enlightenment, so that they can nourish themselves with hope. She could not have said how much time had passed before she found herself back with that luminous being inside the circle she herself had drawn. She had known love before, but until that night, love had also meant fear. That fear, however slight, was always a veil. You could see almost everything through it, but not the colors. And at that moment, with her soulmate, therefore her, she understood that love was a feeling completely bound up with the colors, like thousands of rainbows, superimposed, one on top of the other. How much I missed, simply because I was afraid of missing it, she thought, gazing at those rainbows. She was laying down, and the luminous being was on top of her, with a point of light above his left shoulder, and filaments of light pouring forth from his head and his navel. I wanted to speak to you, but I couldn't, she said. That was because of the wine, he replied. The pub, the wine, and the feeling of irritation were now but a distant memory to Brida. Thank you for the visions. They weren't visions, said the luminous being. What you saw was the wisdom of Earth and of a distant planet. Brida didn't want to talk about that. She didn't want any lesson. She wanted only what she had experienced. Am I full of light too? Yes, just as I am. The same color, the same light, and the same beam of energy. The color was golden now, and the waves of energy emerging from navel and head were brilliant pale blue. I feel that we were lost and now are saved, said Brida. I am tired. We should go back. I had a lot to drink too. Brida knew that somewhere There existed a world of pubs, wheat fields and bus stations, but she didn't want to go back there. All she wanted was to stay in that field forever. She heard a distant voice making invocations while the light around her gradually faded, then vanished completely. An enormous moon lit up the sky, illuminating the countryside. They were naked and in each other's arms, and they felt neither cold nor shame. The magus asked Brida to close the ritual. Since she had begun it, Brida pronounced the words she knew, and he helped where necessary. When the last formula had been spoken, he opened the magic circle. They got dressed and sat down on the ground. "Let us leave this place," said Brida after a while. The magus got up and she followed. She didn't know what to say. She felt awkward, and so did he. They had confessed their love to each other, and now, like any other couple in those circumstances, they were embraced to look each other in the eyes. Then Magus broke the silence. "You must go back to Dublin. I know the number of a taxi firm." Brida didn't know whether to feel disappointed or relieved. The feeling of joy was giving way to nausea and a throbbing head. She was sure that she would make very bad company. "Fine," she said. They turned and walked back to the village. He phoned for a taxi from a telephone box. Then they sat on the curb, waiting for the cab to arrive. "I want to thank you for tonight," she said. He said nothing. "I don't know if the equinox festival is just for witches, but it will be a very important day for me. A party is a party. Then I would like to invite you." He made a gesture as if wanting to change the subject. He must have been thinking the same thing she was. How hard it was to leave your soulmate once you had found them. She imagined him going home alone, wondering when she would come back. She would come back because her heart was telling her to. But the solitude of forest is harder to bear than the solitude of towns. "I don't know if love appears suddenly," Brida went on, "but I know that I am open to love, ready for love." The taxi came. Brida looked again at Magus and felt that he had grown many years younger. "I am ready to love too," he said. The sunlight poured into spacious kitchen through the sparkling clean windows. "Did you sleep well, love?" Her mother put a mug of tea down on the table along with some toast. Then she went back to the cooker where she was frying egg and bacon. "Yes, I did, thanks. By the way, is my dress ready? I need it for the party the day after tomorrow." Her mother brought her the eggs and bacon and sat down. She knew that something odd was going on with her daughter, but could do nothing about it. She would like to talk to her today, as she never had before, but she would achieve little if she did. There was a new world out there, a world she didn't know. She was afraid for her daughter because she loved her and because Brida was alone in that new world. "My dress will be ready, won't it, Mom?" "Yes, by lunchtime," her mother replied, and that made her happy. At least some things in the world hadn't changed. There were certain problems that mothers continued to solve for their daughters. She hesitated, then asked, "How is Lawrence?" Fine, he is coming to pick me up tomorrow evening. She felt simultaneously relieved and sad. Problems of the heart always bruised the soul, and she thanked God that her daughter had no such problems. On the other hand, that was perhaps the one area on which she could advise her, love having changed little over the centuries. They set off for a walk around the little village where Brida had spent her childhood. The houses had remained unchanged and people were still doing the same things they always had. Her daughter met a few old school friends who now worked either at the village's one bank or at stations. They said hello and stopped to chat. Some said how Brida had grown, others how pretty she looked. Around 10 o'clock, they dropped in at the cafe her mother used to go to on Saturdays before she met her husband. In the days when she was still hoping to meet someone and be swept up in some whirlwind romance that would put a stop to the endless identical days. She looked at her daughter again as she told her the latest news about the various people in the village. Brida was still interested, and this pleased her. I really do have to have the dress today, Brida said. She seemed worried, but that couldn't be the reason. She knew that her mother would never let her down. Her mother decided to take a risk and ask the kind of question children always hate, because they are independent, free and capable of solving their own problems. Is anything worrying you? Have you ever been in love with two men at once, Mom? There was a defiant note in her voice, as if life had set its traps only for her. Her mother took a bite of her cake. A distant look came into her eyes as she went off in search of a time that was almost lost. Yes, I have. Brida stared at her in amazement. Her mother smiled and invited her to continue their walk. Your father was my first and greatest love, she said, once they did left the cafe, and I am still very happy with him. When I was younger than you are now, I had everything I could have dreamed of. At the time, my friends and I believed that love was the only reason for living. If you failed to find someone, then you could never claim to have realized your dreams. Stick to the point, Mom. Brida was impatient. I had another dream too, though I dreamed, for example, of doing what you did, going off to the big city and discovering the world that lay beyond my village. The only way I could get my parents to accept my decision was by telling them that I needed to follow some courses of study that wasn't available locally. The sleepless nights I spent thinking about how to broach the subject with them. I planned exactly what I was going to say and what they would say in reply and how I would answer. Her mother had never spoken to her like this before. Brida felt a mixture of affection and regret. They could have enjoyed other such moments, but they were both too caught up in their own worlds and their own values. 2 days before I was going to talk to my parents, I met your father. I looked into his eyes and saw a special light there, as if I did met the person I most wanted to meet in the world. Yes, I have had the same experience. After I met your father, I realized too that my search was over. I didn't need any other explanation of the world. I didn't feel frustrated to be living here, always seeing the same people and doing the same thing. Every day was different because of the great love between us. We started going out together and then we got married. I never talked to him about my dreams of going to live in a big city, of discovering other places and other people, because suddenly the whole world fitted into my village. Love became my explanation for life. You mentioned someone else, Mum. Let me show you something, her mother said in reply. They walked to the bottom of the step that led up to the Catholic church in the village, and which had been destroyed and then rebuilt over the centuries. Brida used to go to Mass there every Sunday, and she remembered that, as a child, climbing those steps had been really hard. At the beginning of each stretch of balustrade was the carving of a St. Paul to the left and St. James to the right, rather worn by time and by tourists. The ground was covered in dry leaves, as if autumn were about to arrive, not spring. The church was at the top of the hill, and it was impossible to see it from where they were because of the trees. Her mother sat down on the first step and invited Brida to do the same. This is where it happened, she said. One afternoon, for some reason or other, I decided to come here to pray. I needed to be alone, to think about my life, and I thought the church would be a good place to do so. When I got here, however, I met a man. He was sitting where you are now, with 2 suitcases beside him, and he looked totally lost, desperately leafing through the book he was holding. I thought he must be a tourist in search of a hotel, and so I went over to him. I ever started talking to him. He seemed a bit startled at first, but then he relaxed. He said that he wasn't lost. He was an archaeologist and had been driving north, where some ruins had been found. When the engine packed up, a mechanic would arrive soon, and so he did decide to visit the church. While he waited, he asked me about the village and the other villages nearby, about historic monuments. Suddenly, all the problems been grappling with disappeared as if by magic. I felt really useful and started telling him everything I knew, feeling that many years spent in region at last had some meaning. Before me, I was a man who had studied people and societies, who might hold in his memory, for the benefit of future generations, everything hard or discovered when I was a child. That man sitting on the step made me understand that I was important to the world and to the history of my country. I felt necessary, and that is the best feeling a human being can have. When I finished telling him about the church, we went on to talk about other things. I told him how proud I was of my village, and he responded with some words by a writer whose name I don't recall now. Something about how understanding your own village helps you understand the world. Tolstoy, said Brida, but her mother was still traveling in time, just as she herself had done one day, except that her mother didn't require cathedral adrift in space, subterranean libraries, or dusty books. She needed only the memory of that spring afternoon and a man sitting on the step with his suitcases. We talked for quite a while. I had the whole afternoon free to spend with him, but since the mechanic might arrive at any moment, I decided to make the most of every second. I asked him about his world, about excavations, about the challenges of spending his life looking for the past in the present. He spoke to me of the warriors, wise men, and pirates who had once inhabited our country. Before I knew it, the sun was low on the horizon, and never in all my life had time passed too quickly. I sensed that he felt the same. He kept asking me questions to keep the conversation going, not giving me time to say that I had to leave. He talked non-stop, telling me all about his experiences, and he wanted to know everything about me too. I could see in his eyes that he desired me, even though at the time I was nearly twice the age you are now. It was spring. There was a lovely smell of new things in the air, and I felt young again. There is a flower that only blooms in the autumn. Well, that afternoon I felt like that flower, as if suddenly in the autumn of my life, when I thought I would experience everything I could experience, that men had appeared on the steps purely to show me that feelings, love, for example, do not grow old along with the body. Feelings form part of a world. I don't know, but it is a world where there is no time, no space, no frontiers. She remained silent for a while. Her eyes were still far off, fixed on that distant spring. There was I, like a 38-year-old adolescent, feeling that someone desired me. He didn't want me to leave. Then, all of a sudden, he stopped talking. He looked deep into my eyes and smiled. It was as if he had understood with his heart what I was thinking, and wanted to tell me that it was true, that I was very important to him. For some time we said nothing, and then we said goodbye. The mechanic had still not arrived. For many days I wondered if that man really had existed, or if he was an angel sent by God to teach me the secret lessons of life. In the end, I decided that he had been a real man, a man who had loved me, even if only for an afternoon, and during that afternoon, he had given me everything he had kept in himself throughout his whole life. His struggles, his joys, his difficulties, and his dreams. That afternoon, I gave myself fully as well. I was his companion, his wife, his audience, his lover. In a matter of only a few hours, I experienced the love of a lifetime. Mother looked at daughter. She hoped her daughter had understood, but deep down she felt that Brida lived in a world in which that kind of love had no place. I have never stopped loving your father, not for a single day, she concluded. He has always been by my side, doing his best, and I want to be with him until the end. But here's a mysterious thing, and I still don't really understand what happened that afternoon. What I do know is that meeting that man left me feeling more confident and showed me I was still capable of loving and being loved, and it taught me something else that I will never forget. Finding one important thing in your life don't mean you have to give up all the other important things. I still think of him sometimes. I would like to know where he is, if he found what he was looking for that afternoon, if he is still alive, or if God took his soul. I know he will never come back, which is why I could love him with such strength and such certainty, because I would never lose him. He had given himself to me entirely that afternoon. Her mother got up. I would better go home and finish making your dress, she said. I think I will stay here for a while, Brida replied. She went over to her daughter and kissed her fondly. "Thanks for listening to me. It is the first time I have ever told anyone that story. I was always afraid I might die without having done so, and that it would be wiped forever from the face of the earth. Now you will keep it for me." Brida went up the step and stood outside the church. This small round building was the pride of the region. It was one of the first places of Christian worship in Ireland, and every year scholars and tourists came to visit it. Nothing remained of the original 5th century structure, apart from some fragments of floor. Each destruction, however, had left some part intact, and so the visitor could trace the history of the various architectural styles that made up the church. Inside, an organ was playing, and Brida stood outside for a while, listening to the music. Everything was so clearly laid out in that church. The universe was exactly where it should be, and anyone coming in through its door, and no need to worry about anything. There were no mysterious forces far above, no dark nights that called on one to believe without understanding. There was no more talk of burning people at the stake, and the religions of the world lived together as if they were allies, binding man once more to God. Her island was still an exception to that peaceful coexistence. In the north, people still killed each other in the name of religion, but that would eventually end. God had almost been explained why. He was our generous Father, and we were all saved. "I am a witch," she said to herself, struggling against a growing impulse to enter the church. Hers was now a different tradition, and even if it was the same God, if she walked through those doors, she would be profaning the place, and would in turn be profaned. She lit a cigarette and stared across at the horizon, trying not to think about these things. She thought, indeed, of her mother. She felt like running back home, flinging her arms about her neck and telling her that in 2 days' time she was going to be initiated into the great mysteries of witchcraft, that she had made journeys in time, that she had experienced the power of sex, that she could guess what was in a shop window using only the technique of the tradition of moon. She needed love and understanding, because she too knew stories she could tell no one. The organ stopped playing, and Brida once again heard the voices of the village, the singing of the birds, the wind stirring the branches and announcing the coming of spring. At the back of the church, a door opened and closed. Someone had left. For a moment she saw herself on a Sunday in her childhood, standing where she was now, feeling irritated because the Mass was so long and Sunday was the only day when she was free to explore the fields. I must go in. Perhaps her mother would understood what she was feeling. But at that moment she was far away. There before her was an empty church. She had never asked Vika precisely what Christianity's role had been in everything that happened. She had a sense that if she walked through that door, she would be betraying all her sisters who had been burned at the stake. But then I was burned at the stake too, she said to herself. She remembered the prayers Vika had said on the day commemorating the martyrdom of the witches, and in that prayer she had mentioned Jesus and the Virgin Mary. Love was above everything else, and there was no hatred in love, only the occasional mistake. At one point, men may have decided to make themselves God's representatives and subsequently made mistakes, but God had nothing to do with that. When she did finally go in, there was no one else inside. A few lit candles showed that someone had taken the trouble that morning to renew their alliance with a force they could only sense, and in that way had crossed the bridge between the visible and the invisible. She regretted her thoughts before entering the church. Nothing was explained here either, and people had to take a chance and plunge into the dark night of faith. Before her arms outspread was that seemingly simple God. He could not help her. She was alone with her decisions, and no one could help her. She needed to learn to take risks. She didn't have the same advantages as the crucified man before her, who had known what his mission was, because he was the Son of God. He had never made a mistake. He had never known ordinary human love, only love for his Father. All he needed to do was to reveal his wisdom and teach humankind the true path to heaven. But was that all? She remembered a Sunday catechism class when the priest had been more inspired than usual. They would be studying the episode when Jesus, sweating blood, was praying to God and asking him to remove the cup from which he was being forced to drink. But why, if he already knew he was the Son of God? Asked the priest. Because he only knew it with his heart. He was absolutely sure his mission would be meaningless because he would not be entirely human. Being human means having doubts and yet still continuing on your path. She looked again at the image, and for the first time in her entire life felt closer to it. There perhaps was a man, frightened and alone, facing death and asking, "Father, Father, why hast thou forsaken me?" If he said that, it was because even he wasn't sure where he was going. He had taken a chance and plunged, as all men do, into the dark night, knowing that he would only find the answer at the end of his journey. He too had to go through the anxiety of making decisions, of leaving his father and mother and his little village to go in search of the secret of men and the mysteries of the law. If he had been through all that, then he must have known love, even though the Gospels never mention this. Love between people is much more difficult to understand than love for a supreme being. But now she remembered that when he had risen again, the first person to whom he appeared was a woman who had accompanied him to the last. The silent image appeared to agree with her. He had known people, wine, bread, parties, and all the beauties of the world. It was impossible that he had not also known the love of a woman, which is why he had sweated blood on the Mount of Olives, because having known the love of one person, it was very hard to leave the earth, to sacrifice himself for the love of all men. He had experienced everything the world could offer, and yet he continued on his journey, knowing that the dark night could end on the cross or on the pyre. Lord, we are all in the world to run the risk of what dark night? I am afraid of death, but even more afraid of wasting my life. I am afraid of love, because it involves things that are beyond our understanding. It sheds such a brilliant light, but the shadow it casts frightens me. She suddenly realized that she was praying That silent, simple God was looking at her, apparently understanding her words and taking them seriously. For a while, she sat waiting for a response from him, but heard not a sound and saw not a sign. The answer was there before her, in that man nailed to the cross. He had played his part and shown to the world that if everyone played their part, no one else would have to suffer, because he had suffered for all those who would had the courage to fight for their dreams. Brida found herself quietly weeping, although she didn't quite know why. The day was overcast, but it wasn't going to rain. Lawrence had lived in that city for many years and knew its clouds. He got up and went into the kitchen to make some coffee. Brida joined him just as the water was boiling. "You came to bed very late last night," he said. She didn't answer. "Today's the day," he went on, "and I know how important it is to you. I would love to be there with you." "It is a party," said Brida. "What does that mean?" "It is a party, and for as long as we have known each other, we have always gone to parties together. You are invited too." The Magus went out to see if the previous day's rain had damaged the bromeliads in his garden. They were fine, and he smiled to himself. To seemed that the forces of nature did sometimes collaborate. He thought about Vika. She wouldn't be able to see the points of light, because they were visible only to the respective soulmates, but she was sure to notice the energy from the rays of light moving between him and her student, witches were, above all else, women. The tradition of the moon described this as the vision of love, and although it was something that could happen between people who were not each other's soulmate, but merely in love, he imagined that it would nevertheless fill her with anger, female anger, the kind felt by Snow White's stepmother, who could not allow another woman to be more beautiful than her. Vika, however, was a teacher and would immediately realize how absurd such feelings of anger were, but by then her aura would already have changed color. He would go over to her, then kiss her on the cheek and say that he could see she was jealous. She would deny this, and he would ask why she was angry. She would say that she was a woman and didn't need to explain her feelings. He would give her another kiss on the cheek, because what she said was true, and he would tell her how much he would miss her during the time they had been apart, and that he still admired her more than any other woman in the world, with the exception of Brida, because Brida was his soulmate. Vika, being a wise woman, would feel happy then. "I must be getting old," he thought. "I am starting to imagine conversations." Then it occurred to him that it wasn't just a matter of age. That was how men in love had always behaved. Vika was pleased because the rain had stopped and the clouds would clear before nightfall. Nature needed to be in accord with the work of human being. She had taken all the necessary steps. Everyone had played their part. Everything was in place. She went over to the altar and invoked her teacher. She asked him to be present that night. 3 new witches were to be initiated into the great mysteries, and she had sole responsibility for their initiation. Then she went to the kitchen to make some coffee. She squeezed some orange juice and ate some toast and a few crisp breads. She still took care of her appearance because she knew how pretty she was. She didn't need to neglect her beauty in order to prove that she was also intelligent and capable. While she distractedly stirred her coffee, she remembered a day just like this many years before, when her teacher had sealed her destiny with the great mysteries. For a moment, she tried to imagine the person she had been then, what her dreams had been, what she would wanted from life. I must be getting old, she said out loud, sitting here, thinking about the past. She drank her coffee and began her preparations. There were still things to do, she knew, though, that she wasn't getting old. In her world, time did not exist. Brida was surprised by the number of cars parked by the roadside. That morning's heavy cloud had been replaced by a clear sky from which the last rays of the setting sun were now fading. Despite the distinct chill in the air, it was still the first day of spring. She invoked the protection of the spirits of the forest and then looked at Lawrence. He rather awkwardly repeated the same word, and yet he seemed quite happy to be there. If they were to remain together, they would each from time to time have to enter the other's reality. Between them two, there existed a bridge between the visible and the invisible. Magic was present in their every act. They walked quickly through the wood and soon reached the clearing. Brida was prepared now for what she saw. Men and women of all ages and doubtless from a wide range of professions were gathered in groups, talking and trying to make the whole event seem like the most natural thing in the world. In reality, though, they were feeling as perplexed as she and Lawrence. Are all these people part of the ceremony? Lawrence asked, for he hadn't been expecting such a crowd. Brida explained that some, like him, were guests. She didn't know exactly who would be taking part, but all would be revealed at the chosen moment. They selected a corner to put their things down, including the bag Lawrence was carrying. Inside were Brida's dress and 3 bottles of wine. Vika had recommended that each person, both participants and guests, should bring a large bottle of wine. Before they left the house, Lawrence had asked who the other guest was. Brida told him that it was the Magus whom she went to visit in the mountains, and Lawrence gave the matter no further thought. Imagine, he heard a woman next to him comment, imagine what my friends would say if they know I was at a real witch's Sabbath. A witch's Sabbath. The celebration that had survived the spilled blood, the fires, the age of reason and oblivion. Lawrence tried to reassure himself. After all, there were many other people like him there. However, a shudder ran through him when he saw a pile of logs in the middle of the clearing. Vika was talking to some other people, but as soon as she saw Brida, she came over to say hello and ask if she was all right. Brida thanked her for her kindness and introduced Lawrence. And I have invited someone else as well, she said. Vika looked at her, surprised, then smiled broadly. Brida was sure she knew who she meant. I am glad, Vika said. After all, it is his celebration too, and it is ages since I saw that old wizard. Maybe he has learned a thing or two. More people arrived, and Brida couldn't tell who were the guests and who were the participants. Half an hour later, when almost 100 people were gathered in the clearing, talking quietly, Vika called for silence. "There is a ceremony," she said, "but it is also a celebration, and no celebration can begin without everyone filling their glass." She opened her bottle of wine and filled the glass of the person next to her. The wine was soon flowing freely, and the voices grew louder. Brida didn't want to drink. Still fresh in her memory was a field of wheat in which a man had shown her the secret temples of the tradition of the moon. Besides, the guests she was expecting had still not arrived. Lawrence, on the other hand, was starting to feel much more relaxed and had started chatting to the people around him. "It really is a party," he said to Brida, smiling. He had come there expecting something extraordinary, but it turned out it was just a party and much more fun than the parties held by his fellow scientists. A little way off stood a man with a white beard, whom he recognized as a professor from the university. He didn't know quite what to do, but after a while the professor recognized him too and raised his glass in greeting. Lawrence felt relieved. Witches were no longer hunted, nor were their sympathizers. "It is like a picnic," Brida heard someone say. Yes, it was like a picnic, and that made her feel rather irritated. She had expected something more ritualistic, more like the Sabbath that had inspired Goya, Saints and Picasso. She picked up the bottle beside her and began to drink. A party, crossing the bridge between the visible and the invisible by means of a party. Brida was intrigued to know how anything sacred could possibly happen in such a secular atmosphere. Night was falling fast, and people continued to drink just as darkness threatened to submerge everything. Some of the men present, without performing any specific ritual, lit the fire. That is how it had been in the past, before fire became a powerful element in the rituals of witchcraft. It had been merely a source of light, a light around which women gathered to talk about their men, their magical experiences, their encounters with incubi and succubi, the much feared sexual demons of the Middle Ages. That is how it had been in the past, a party, a huge popular festival, a joyful celebration of spring and hope, in an age when being happy was a challenge to the law because no one could enjoy themselves in a world made only to tempt the weak. The lords of the land, shut up in their dark castles, gazed out at the fires in the forests and felt as if they would be robbed. Those peasants were eager to happiness, and no one who has experienced happiness can never again feel at ease with sadness. The peasants might then expect to be happy all year round, and what would threaten the whole political and religious system? 4 or 5 people who were already slightly tipsy began dancing round the fire, perhaps in imitation of a witch's Sabbath. Amongst the dancers, Brida saw an initiate whom she would met when Vika commemorated the martyrdom of the sisters. She was shocked. She had assumed followers of the tradition of the moon would behave in a way more in keeping with that sacred place. She remembered the night she had spent with the magus and how drink had hindered communication between them during their astral travel. "My friends," will be green and envy. She heard someone say, "They will never believe I was here." That was too much. She needed to get a little distance to understand properly what was going on and to resist a strong desire simply to leave and go home before she became entirely disillusioned with everything she would believed in for nearly a year now. She looked for Vika and saw her talking and laughing with some of the guests. The number of people dancing around the fire was growing larger all the time. Some were clapping and singing, accompanied by others keeping time by beating on the empty bottles with a stick and keys. "I need to go for a walk," she told Lawrence. A group of people had gathered around him, fascinated by what he was telling them about ancient stars and the miracles of modern physics. However, he immediately stopped talking and asked, "Would you like me to come with you?" "No, I would rather be alone." She left the group and headed off into the forest. The voices were growing ever louder and more raucous, and everything, the darkness, the comments, the people playing at being witches and wizards around the fire, became mixed up in her head. She had waited so long for this night, but it was turning out to be just another party, like one of those charity doors where people eat, get drunk, tell talks and jokes, and then make speeches about he need to help the Indians in the southern hemisphere or the seals at the North Pole. She began walking through the forest, always keeping within sight of the fire. She walked along a path that gave her a view from above the central stone. However, seen from high up, the view was ever more disappointing. Vika was busy circulating among the different groups, asking if everything was all right. People were dancing around the fire. A few couples were already exchanging their first drunken kisses. Lawrence was talking animatedly to two men, perhaps about things that would have been fine in the setting of the bar, but not at a celebration like this. A latecomer entered the wood, a stranger attracted by the noise, in search of a little fun. She recognized his way of walking. The magus. Startled, Brida began running back down the path. She wanted to reach him before he got to the party. She needed him to help her, as he had before. She needed to understand the meaning of what was going on there. Vika certainly knows how to organize a Sabbath, thought the magus was as he approached. He could see and feel the free flow of energy among the people present at this phase of the ritual. The Sabbath resembled any other party. It was important to ensure that all the guests were on the same wavelength. At his first Sabbath, she had felt very shocked by all this. He remembered calling his teacher over and asking him what was going on. "Haven't you ever been to a party before?" his teacher had asked, annoyed at the magus for interrupting an interesting conversation. Of course he had, the magus said. "And what makes for a good party? Everyone enjoying themselves. Men have been holding parties since the days when they lived in caves," said his teacher. "They are the first group ritual we know of, and the tradition of the sun took it upon itself to keep that ritual alive. A good party cleanses the mind of all those taking part, but it is very difficult to make that happen. It only takes a few people to spoil the general mood. Those people think They are more important than the others. They are hard to please. They think they are wasting their time because they can't make contact with anyone else. And they usually end up the victims of a mysterious form of poetic justice. They tend to live weighted down by the astral larvae given off by those people who have managed to bond with others. Remember, the first road to God is prayer, the second is joy. Many years had passed since that conversation with his teacher. The Magus had taken part in many Sabbaths since then, and he knew that this was a very skillful, arranged example. The collective energy level was growing all the time. He looked for Brida. There were a lot of people there, and he wasn't used to crowds. He knew that he needed to partake of that collective energy, and he was quite prepared to do so. But first, he needed to reaccustom himself. She could help him. He would feel more at ease once he had found her. He was a magus. He knew about the point of light. All he needed was to alter his state of consciousness, and the point of light would appear in the midst of all those people. For years he had searched for that light, and now it was there, only yards away from him. The magus altered his state of consciousness. He looked again at the people gathered there, this time with a changed perception, and he could see a vast range of different colored auras. All of them, though, were shifting closer to the color that would predominate that night. Vika really is an excellent teacher, he thought again. She works very fast. Soon all the auras, the energy vibration that surrounded each physical body, would be vibrating as one, and then the second part of the ritual could begin. He looked to left and right and finally located the point of light. He decided to surprise her and approached without a sound. Brida, he said. His soulmate turned round. She is gone for a walk, a young man said politely. For a moment that seemed to last forever, the magus looked at the man standing before him. You must be the magus that Brida had told me so much about, said Lawrence. Join us. She wouldn't be long. But Brida was already there. She was standing opposite to two men, breathing hard, eyes wide. From the other side of the fire, Magus sensed someone watching. He knew that look. It would not be able to see the point of light, because only soulmates could recognize each other. But it was a deep and ancient look, one that knew the tradition of moon and the herds of men and women. The magus turned and faced Vika. She smiled at him from the other side of the fire. In a fraction of a second, she had understood everything. Brida also had her eyes fixed on Magus. They were alight with pleasure. He had come. I would like to introduce you to Lawrence, she said. The party suddenly seemed like fun, and she no longer needed any explanations. The magus was still in what altered state of consciousness. He saw Brida's aura rapidly changing and moving towards the color that Vika had chosen. She was pleased and happy that he had come, and everything he said or did could so easily ruin her initiation. That night he must, at all costs, control his feelings. Pleased to meet you, he said to Lawrence. How about pouring me a glass of wine? Lawrence smiled and held out the bottle. Welcome to the group, he said. I am sure you will enjoy the party. Vika looked away and gave a sigh of relief. Brida had noticed nothing. She was a good student, and Vika would have been loath to remove her from that night's initiation ceremony because she had failed to take the simplest step of all, but not joining in with the general good cheer. And he can take care of himself. The Magus had years of work and discipline behind him. He would be capable of keeping his feeling in check long enough, at least to replace those feelings with something else. She respected his hard work and his stubbornness and felt slightly afraid of his immense power. She chatted with a few of other guests, but couldn't quite get over her surprise at what she would just seen. So that was why he had paid so much attention to Brida, who was, after all, a witch like any other witch who had spent various incarnations learning the tradition of the moon. Brida was his soulmate. My feminine intuition clearly isn't working very well. She had imagined everything except that most obvious of reasons. She consoled herself by thinking that at least the result of all her curiosity had been a positive one. It was a path chosen by God to enable her to rediscover her student. The Magus spotted someone he knew in the crowd and excused himself for a moment to go and speak to him. Brida was euphoric, enjoying his presence there before her, but she felt it best to let him leave. Her feminine intuition was telling her that it was best if he had Lawrence didn't spend too much time together. They might become friends, and when two men are in love with the same woman, it is better that they hate each other than that they become friends, because if that happened, she would end up losing them both. She looked at the people round the fire and suddenly she felt like dancing too. She asking Lawrence to join her. He hesitated for a second, but then took courage and said yes. People were still spinning around and clapping, drinking wine and beating out a rhythm on the empty wine bottles with sticks and keys. Whenever she danced past the Magus, he smiled and raised his glass to her. This was one of the best nights of her life. Vika joined the circle of dancers, where everyone was feeling relaxed and happy. The guests, who had been rather anxious about what might happen and worried about what they might see, had now entered fully into the spirit of the night. Spring had arrived, and they needed to celebrate, to fill their soul with faith in future sunlit days, and forget as quickly as possible the grey evening and lonely nights spent at home. The clapping grew louder, and now it was Vika setting the rhythm. It was an insistent, regular rhythm. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the fire. No one was cold. It was as if summer had arrived already. The people round the fire began to take off their sweaters. Let us sing, said Vika. She sang a simple two-verse song several times, and soon everyone was singing with her. A few people recognized it as a witch's mantra. Where that mattered was the sound of the word, not the meaning. It was the sound of union with the gifters, and those endowed with magic vision, like Magus and the other teachers present, could see the filament of light joining various people. Lawrence eventually grew bored with the dancing and went to join the musicians. Others moved away from the fire, some because they were tired and others because Vika had asked them to help keep the rhythm going. Only the initiates noticed that was happening, that the party was beginning to enter sacred territory. Very soon, the only people dancing around the fire were the women from the tradition of moon and the witches who were to be initiated that night. Even Vika's male students stopped dancing. The initiation ritual for the men was different and took place on a different date. What was turning and turning in the astral plane immediately above the fire was female energy, the energy of transformation. So it had been since time immemorial. Brida began to feel very hot. It couldn't be the wine, because she did drink very little. It was probably the flames from the fire. She had a great desire to take off her blouse, but she felt embraced, an embracement that gradually lost all meaning as she clapped and sang that simple song and danced around the fire. Her eyes were now fixed on the flames, and the world seems less and less important. It was a feeling very similar to the one she would experienced when the tarot cards had revealed themselves to her for the first time. I am going into a trance, she thought. But so what? This part is fun. What strange music, Lawrence was thinking as he kept time, beating the bottle. His ear, trained to listen to his own body, had noticed that the rhythm of the clapping and the sound of the words vibrated exactly in the middle of his chest, as happened when he heard the bass drum in a concert of classical music. The odd thing was that the rhythm also seemed to be dictating the beating of his heart. As Vika quickened the pace, his heart beat faster too. The same thing must be happening to everyone. More blood is flowing to my brain, the scientific part of his mind told him. But he was part of witches' ritual, and this was no time to be thinking such things. He could talk to Brida about it later. I am at a party and I went to have fun, he said out loud. Someone beside him cried, "Here, here," and Vika's clapping grew a little faster. I am free. I am proud of my body because it is the manifestation of God in the visible world. The heat from the fire was becoming unbearable. The world seemed far away, and she no longer cared about superficial things. She was alive. The blood was coursing through her vein, and she was entirely given over, body and soul, to her search, dancing round. That fire was not new to her, for the rhythm awoke dormant memories of when she had been a teacher of the wisdom of time. She wasn't alone, because that party was a re-encounter with herself and with the tradition she would carried through many lives. She felt a profound respect for herself. She was once again in a body, and it was a beautiful body, one that had fought for millions of years to survive in a hostile world. It had lived in the sea, crawled upon the earth, climbed trees, walked on all fours, and was now proudly standing with its 2 feet on the ground. That body deserved respect for its long struggle. There were no beautiful or ugly bodies, because all had followed the same trajectory. All were the visible part of the soul they inhabited. She felt proud, deeply proud of her body. She took off her blouse. She wasn't wearing a bra, but that didn't matter. Yes, she was proud of her body, and no one could criticize her for that. Even if she were 70-year-old, she would still be proud of her body, because it was through her body that the soul could do its work. The other woman around the fire did the same, and that didn't matter either. She unbuckled the belt on her trousers and finally stood there completely naked. She felt freer than at any other time in her entire life. There was no reason behind what she was doing. She was doing it simply because nakedness was the only way to show how free her soul was at that moment. It didn't matter that other people were there. clothed and watching. All she wished was that they could feel about their bodies as she felt about her. She could dance freely and nothing impeded her movements. Every atom of her body was touching the air, and the air was generous. It brought with it from afar secret and perfume to clothe her from head to toes. The men and the other guests beating the wine bottle noticed that the women around the fire were naked. They clapped or held hand and sang, sometimes softly and sometimes wildly. No one knew who was setting the rhythm, whether it was the people beating time on the bottles, the clapping, or the music. They all seemed aware of what was happening, but if at that moment one of them had been brave enough to break the rhythm, they could not have done so. At this point in the ritual, one of teacher's greatest problem was making sure that no one realized they were in a trance. They needed to feel that they were in control, even though they weren't. Wicca was not violating the one law which, if broken, was punished by the tradition with exceptional severity, manipulating the free will of others, because everyone there knew they were present at a witch's Sabbath, and for witches, life meaning communion with the universe. Later, when this night was just a memory, none of these people would tell what they had seen. There was no prohibition on doing so, but they all felt they were in presence of powerful force, a mysterious sacred force, intense and implacable, one that no human being would dare to defy. Turn, said the woman in the black, ankle-length dress. She was the only woman till fully clothed. All the others were naked as they danced and clapped the spun. A man placed a pile of dresses beside her. 3 of them would be worn for the first time, and 2 were very similar in style. These were people with the same gift, which took material form in the dress which woman had dreamed. There was no need for Wicca to clap now, for the others continued to do so as if she were still keeping the beat. She knelt down, pressed her thumbs to her head, and began to work the power. The power of tradition of moon, the wisdom of time was there. It was highly dangerous power, one that witches could only invoke once they had become teachers. Wicca knew how to use it, but even so, she first asked for her teacher's protection. In that power dwelled the wisdom of time. There was the serpent, wise and masterful. Only the virgin, by crushing the serpent's head beneath her heel, could subjugate it, and so Wicca prayed to the Virgin Mary as well, asking her for purity of soul, steadiness of hand, and the protection of her cloak, so that she could bring down that power on the woman before her without it seducing or overwhelming any of them. With her face lifted to the sky, her voice steady and confident, she recited the words of St. Paul: "If any man defile the temple of God, him shall God destroy, for the temple of God is holy, which temple ye are. Let no man deceive himself. If any man among you seemeth to be wise in this world, let him become a fool, that he may be wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God. For it is written, He taketh the wise in their own craftiness. And again, the Lord knoweth the thought of the wise, that they are vain. Therefore let no man glory in men, for all things are yours." With a few deft movement of her hand, Vika slowed the rhythm of the clapping. The people beating on the wine bottles beat more slowly, and the woman too began to spin and turn more slowly. Vika was keeping the power under control, and the whole orchestra had to work well, for the loudest horn to the quickest violin. To achieve this, she needed the assistance of the power, but without actually surrendering to it. She clapped her hands and made the necessary noises. Gradually, everyone stopped playing and dancing. The witches came over to Vika and picked up their dresses. Only 3 women remained naked. At that point, there had been an hour and 28 minutes of continuous sound, and although all those present were in a state of altered consciousness, none of them, with the exception of the 3 naked women, had for one moment lost a sense of where they were or what they were doing. The 3 naked women, however, were still in a trance. Vika held out her ritual dagger and directed all its concentrated energy at them. Their gifts would soon become apparent. This was their way of saving the world. Having walked long and tortuous paths, they had finally arrived. The world had tested them in every possible way, and they were worthy of what they had achieved. In daily life, they would continue to have their customary weakness and resentment, perform their usual small act of kindness and of cruelty. The agony and the ecstasy would continue, as it would for everyone who is part of a world in a constant state of flux. However, at the appointed time, they would learn that each human being carries within them something far more important than their own self, namely their particular gift. For God placed in the hand of each and every person a gift, the instrument he used to reveal himself to the world and to help humanity. God chose human being to be his helper on earth. Some came to understand their gift through the tradition of the sun, others through the tradition of the moon, but all eventually learned that their gift was, even if it took several incarnations to do so. Vika stood by the great stone played there by Celtic priestess. The witches in their black robes formed a semicircle around her. She looked at the 3 naked women. Their eyes were shining. "Come here." The woman walked into the middle of the semicircle. Vika then asked them to lie face down on the ground with their arms outstretched to form a cross. The magus watched Brida lie down on the ground. He tried to concentrate only on her aura, but he was a man, and a man always looks at a woman's body. He didn't want to remember. He didn't want to think about whether he was suffering or not. He was aware of only one thing, that his mission with his soulmate beside him was over. It is a shame to have spent so little time with her, but he couldn't think like that. Somewhere in time, they had shared the same body, felt the same pain, and been made happy by the same pleasures. Perhaps they had walked together through a forest similar to this and gazed up at the nighty sky where the same bright star shone. He smiled at the thought of his teacher, who had made him spend so long in the forest merely in order that he should understand his encounter with his soulmate. What was how things were in the tradition of the sun. Each person was obliged to learn what he needed to learn and not merely what he wanted to learn. In his man's heart, he would weep for a long time, but in his magus heart, he felt exultant and grateful to the forest. Vika looked at the 3 women lying at her feet and gave thanks to God that she had been able to continue doing the same work throughout so many lives. The tradition of the mound was inexhaustible. The clearing in the wood had been consecrated by Celtic priestess in the time now long forgotten, and little reminded of their rituals, only perhaps the stone before which she was standing. It was a huge stone, so large it could not possibly have been transported there by human hands. But then the ancients had known how to move such stones by magical means. They had built pyramids, observatories, and walled cities in the mountains of South America, using only the forces known to be tradition of the moon. Such knowledge was no longer needed by men and had been erased from time so that it could not be turned to destructive ends. Nevertheless, out of pure curiosity, Wicca would look to have known how they had done it. There were a few Celtic priestesses present, and she greeted them. They were teachers who had ceased being reincarnated and now formed part of Earth's secret government. Without them, without the strength of their knowledge, the planet would long since have lost its way. Above the trees, to the left of the clearing, these Celtic teachers were hovering in the air, astral bodies surrounded by an intense white light. Through the centuries, they had come there at every equinox to make sure that the tradition was being maintained. Yes, said Wicca with a certain pride. The equinoxes continued to be celebrated even after all Celtic culture had disappeared from the official history of the world, because no one can destroy the tradition of the moon, only the hand of God. She observed the priestess for a while longer. What would they make of people today? Did they feel a nostalgia for the day when they used to come to this place and when contact with God seemed simpler and more direct? Wicca thought not, and her instinct was confirmed. The garden of God was being constructed out of human emotions, and for this to happen, people had to live a long time in different ages, often adopting very different customs. As in the rest of the universe, man was following his evolutionary path, and each day he was better than on the previous day, even if he forgot the previous day's lessons, even if he complained, claiming that life was unfair. Because the kingdom of heavens is like the seed that a man plants in a field. He sleeps and wakes day and night. The seed grows even though he knows not how. These lessons were engraved on the soul of the world and existed for the benefit of all humanity. It was important that there were still people like those present at the ceremony, people who were not afraid of the dark night of the soul. As wise St. John of the Cross had described it, each step, each act of faith redeemed the whole human race anew. As long as there were people who knew that, in God's eye, all of man's wisdom was madness, the world would continue along the path of light. She felt proud of her pupil, male and female, who had proved capable of sacrificing the comfort of the world of nice, neat explanations for the challenge of discovering a new world. She looked again at the three naked women lying on the ground, arms outstretched, and tried to clothe them again in the color of the aura they emanated. They were now traveling through time and meeting many lost soulmates. Those three women would from that night on plunge into the mission that had been awaiting them since they were born. One was over 60, but age was of no importance. What mattered was that they were finally face to face with the destiny that had been patiently awaiting them, and from now on they would use their gifts to keep safe certain crucial plants in God's garden. Each one had arrived at this place for different reasons: a failed love affair, a sense of weariness with routine, or perhaps a search for power. They had confronted fear, inertia, and many disappointments that assail those who follow the path of magic. But the fact is, they had reached the place they needed to reach, for the hand of God always guides those who follow their path with faith. The tradition of the moon is a fascinating one, with its teachers and its rituals, but there is another tradition too, thought the magus, his eyes still fixed on Brida and feeling slightly envious of Vika, who would remain by her side for a long time. That other tradition was a more difficult one to follow because it was simple, and simple things always seem so complicated. Its teachers lived in the world and did not always realize the importance of what they were teaching, because the impulse behind that teaching often seemed nothing more than an absurd impulse. They were carpenters, poets, mathematicians, people from all professions and walks of life who lived scattered throughout the world, people who suddenly felt the need to talk to someone, to explain a feeling they couldn't quite understand, but which was impossible to keep themselves. And that was the way in which the tradition of sun kept its knowledge alive, the impulse of creation. Whatever there were people, there was always some trace of tradition of the sun. Sometimes it was a sculpture, sometimes a table, at others a few lines from a poem passed from generation to generation by a particular group or tribe. The people through which the tradition of sun spoke were people just like anyone else, and who, one morning or one evening, looked at the world and felt the presence of something greater. They had unwillingly plunged into an unknown sea, and for the most part, they did not do so again. Everyone, at least once in each incarnation, possessed the secret of the universe. They found themselves momentarily immersed in the dark night, but lacking sufficient self-belief. They rarely returned to it, and the sacred heart, which nourished the world with love and peace and devotion, found itself once more surrounded by thorns. Vika was glad. She was a teacher of the tradition of moon. Everyone who came to her was eager to learn, while in the tradition of the sun, most were in permanent flight from what life was teaching them. Not that it matters, thought Vika, because the age of miracle was returning, and no one could remain indifferent to the changes the world was beginning to experience. Within a few years, the power of the tradition of the sun would reveal itself in all its brilliance. Anyone not already following their own path would begin to feel dissatisfied with themselves, and he forced to make a choice. They would either have to accept an existence beset with disappointment and pain, or else come to realize that everyone was born to be happy. Having made their choice, they would have no option but to change, and the great struggle, the jihad, would begin. With one perfect movement of her hand, Vika drew a circle on the air with her dagger. Inside that invisible circle, she drew a 5-pointed star, which witches called the pentagram. The pentagram was the symbol of the elements, at work in mankind, and through it the woman laying on the ground would now come into contact with the world of light. Close your eyes, said Vika. The three women obeyed. Above the head of each of them, Vika performed the ritual moves with her dagger. Now open the eyes of your souls. Brida opened the eyes of her soul. She was in a desert and the place looked very familiar. She remembered that she had been there before, with Magus. She looked around but couldn't see him. Yet she wasn't afraid. She felt calm and happy. She knew who she was and there she lived. She knew that in some other place in time a party was going on, but none of this mattered because the landscape before her was so much prettier. The sand, the mountains in the distance, and a huge stone. Welcome, said a voice. Beside her stood a gentleman wearing clothes like those worn by her grandfather. I am Vika's teacher. When you become a teacher, your students will find Vika here, and so on and so forth, until the soul of the world finally makes itself manifest. I am at a ritual for witches, Brida said. A Sabbath. The teacher laughed. You have found your path. Few people have the courage to do so. They prefer to follow a path that is not their own. Everyone has a gift, but they choose not to see it. You accepted yours, and your encounter with your gift is your encounter with the world. But why? So that you can plant God's garden. I have a life ahead of me, said Brida. I want to live that life just like anyone else. I want to be able to make mistakes, to be selfish, to have faults. The teacher smiled. In his right hand a blue cloak suddenly appeared. You can only be close to people if you are one of them. The scene around her changed. She was no longer in a desert, but immersed in a kind of liquid in which various strange creatures were swimming. Life is about making mistakes, said the teacher. Cells went on reproducing themselves in exactly the same way for millions of years, until one of them made a mistake and introduced change into that endless cycle of repetition. Brida was gazing in amazement at the sea. She didn't ask how it was possible for them to breathe in there. All she could hear was teacher's voice. All she could think of was a very similar journey she had made and which had begun in a field of wheat. It was a mistake that set the world in motion, said the teacher. Never be afraid of making a mistake. But Adam and Eve were driven out of paradise, and they will return one day knowing the miracle of the heavens and of all the world. God knew what he was doing when he drew their attention to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If he hadn't wanted them to eat it, he would never have mentioned it. So, why did he then? In order to set the universe in motion. The scene changed back to the desert and the storm. It was morning, and the horizon was becoming suffused with pink light. The teacher came towards her with the cloak. I consecrate you now, in this moment. Your gift is God's instrument. May you prove to be a useful tool. Vika picked up the dress belonging to the youngest of the three women and held it up in her two hands. She made a symbolic offering to the Celtic priestess who in astral form were watching everything from above the trees. Then she turned to the young woman. Stand up, she said. Brida stood up. The shadows from the fire flickered over her naked body. Once another body had been consumed by those same flames, but that time was over. Raise your arms. Brida raised her arms. Vika put the dress on her. I was naked, she said to the teacher when he had wrapped the cloak about her, and I was not ashamed. If it wasn't for shame, God would never have discovered that Adam and Eve and eaten the apple. The teacher was watching the sunrise. He seemed distracted, but he wasn't. Brida knew this. Never be ashamed, he said. Accept what life offers you and try to drink from every cup. All wines should be tasted. Some should only be sipped, but with others, drink the whole bottle. How will I know which is which? By the taste. You can only know a good wine if you have first tasted a bad one. Vika turned Brida round to face the fire, then moved on to the next initiate. The fire picked up the energy of her gift so that it could be made manifest in her. At that moment, Brida was watching a sunrise, a sun that would from then on light the rest of her life. Now you must go, said the teacher as soon as the sun had risen. I am not afraid of my gift, Brida told him. I know where I am going and what I am going to do. I know that someone helped me to arrive here. I have been here before. There were people dancing and a secret temple built on to celebrate the tradition of the moon. The teacher said nothing. He turned to her and made a sign with his right hand. You have been accepted, many your path. Be one of peace in time of peace, and of combat in time of combat. Never confuse one with the other. The figure of the teacher began to dissolve along with the desert and the stone. Only the sun remained, but the sun began to become one with the sky. Then the sky grew dark and the sun became more like the flames of the fire. She was back. She remembered everything now. The noise, the clapping, the dancing, the trance. She remembered having taken off her clothes in front of all these people, and now she felt rather awkward. But she also remembered her meeting with the teacher. She tried to master her feelings of shame and fear and anxiety. They would always be with her, and she must get used to them. Vika asked the three initiates to stand in the very middle of the semicircle formed by the woman. The witches joined hands with made a ring. They sang song that no one now dared to accompany. The sounds flowed from their barely open lips, creating a strange vibration which grew ever shriller until it resembled the cry of some crazed bird. At some point in the future, she would learn how to make these sounds. She would learn many more things until she became a teacher too. Then other men, the women, would be initiated by her into the tradition of the moon. All of this, however, would happen at the appointed moment. She had all the time in the world. Now that she had found her destiny again and had someone to help her, eternity was hers. Everyone appeared to have strange colors around them, and Brida felt slightly bewildered. She liked the world as it had been before. The witches stopped singing. The initiation of the moon is finished and complete, said Vika. The world is now a field, and you will work to make sure that there is a good harvest. I feel strange, said one of the initiates. Everything's blurred. What you are seeing is the energy field that surrounds each individual, their aura, as we call it. That is the first step along the path of the great mysteries. The sensation will soon fade, and later I will teach you how to awaken it again. With one shift, agile movement, she flung her ritual dagger to the ground. It stuck fast, the handle still trembling with the force of the impact. "The ceremony is over," she said. Brida went over to Lawrence. His eyes were shining, and she felt how very proud he was of her and how much he loved her. They could grow together, create a new way of living, discover a whole universe that lay before them, just waiting for people of courage like them. But there was another man too. While she was talking to Vika's teacher, she had made her choice because that other man would be able to take her hand during difficult moments and lead her with experience and love through the dark night of faith. She would learn to love him, and her love for him would be a great as her respect. They were both walking the same road to knowledge, and because of him she had reached the point where she was now. With him she would one day learn the tradition of the sun. Now she knew that she was a witch. She had learned the art of witchcraft over many centuries and was back where she should be. From that night on, wisdom and knowledge would be the most important thing in her life. "We can leave now," said Lawrence. He was gazing with admiration at this woman dressed all in black. Brida, however, knew that the magus would be seeing her dressed all in blue. She held out the bag containing her other clothes. "You go ahead and see if you can get us a lift. I need to speak to someone." Lawrence took the bag, but only went a little way toward the path through the forest. The ritual was over, and they were back in the world of men, with their loves, their jealousies, and their war of conquest. Fear had come back too. Brida was behaving oddly. "I don't know if God exists," he said to the trees around him. "And yet I can't think about that now because I, too, face to face with a mystery." He felt he was talking in a different way with a strange confidence he had never known he possessed, but at that moment he believed that the trees were listening to him. "The people here may not understand me. They may despise my efforts, but I know that I am as brave as they are because I seek God even though I don't believe in him. If he exists, he is the God of the brave." Lawrence noticed that his hands were trembling slightly. The night had passed, and he had understood nothing of what went on. He knew that he had entered into the trance state, but that was all. However, the fact that his hands were shaking had nothing to do with that plunge into the dark night, as Brida called it. He looked up at the sky, still full of low clouds. God was the God of the brave, and he would understand him, because the brave are those who make a decision despite their fear, who are tormented by the devil every step of the way and gripped by anxiety about their every action, wondering if they are right or wrong, and yet nevertheless they act. They do so because they also believe in miracles, like the witches who had danced around the fire that night. God might be trying to return to him through that woman who was now walking away towards another man. If she left, perhaps God would live forever. She was his opportunity, because she knew that the best way to immerse oneself in God was through love. He didn't want to lose the chance of getting her back. He took a deep breath, feeling the cold, pure air of the forest in his lungs, and he made a sacred promise to himself. God was the God of the brave. Brida walked over to Magus. They met by the fire. Words came only with difficulty. She was the one to break the silence. "We are on the same path," He nodded. So let us follow it together. But you don't love me, said the magus. I do love you. I don't yet know my love for you, but I do love you. You are my soulmate. The magus still had a distant look in his eyes. He was thinking about the tradition of the sun and how one of the most important lessons of the tradition of the sun was love. Love was the only bridge between the visible and the invisible, known to everyone. It was the only effective language for translating the lessons to the universe taught to human being every day. I am not going anywhere, she said. I am staying with you. Your boyfriend is waiting, replied Magus. I will bless your love. Brida looked at him, puzzled. No one can possess a sunset like the one we saw that evening, he went on, just as no one can possess an afternoon of rain beating against the window, or the serenity of a sleeping child, or the magical moment when the waves break on the rocks. No one can possess the beautiful things of this earth, but we can know them and love them. It is through such moments that God reveals himself to mankind. We are not the masters of the sun or the afternoon, of the waves, or even of the vision of God, because we cannot possess ourselves. The magus held out his hand to Brida and gave her a flower. When we first met, although it seems to me that I have always known you, because I can't remember the world before that, I showed you the dark night. I wanted to see how you would face up to your own limitations. I knew that you were my soulmate and that you would teach me everything I needed to learn. That is why God divided man and woman. Brida touched the flower. It seemed to her that it was the first flower she had seen in months. Spring had arrived. People give flowers as presents because flowers contain the true meaning of love. Anyone who tries to possess a flower will have to watch its beauty fading. But if you simply look at a flower in a field, you will keep it forever, because the flower is part of evening and the sunset and the smell of damp earth and the clouds on the horizon. Brida was looking at flower. Magus took it from her and returned it to the forest. Brida's eyes filled with a tear. She was proud of her soulmate. That is what the forest taught me, that you will never be mine, and that is why I will never lose you. You were my hope during my days of loneliness, my anxiety during moments of doubt, my certainty during moments of faith. Knowing that my soulmate would come one day, I devoted myself to learning the tradition of the sun. Knowing that you existed was my one reason for continuing to live. Brida could no longer conceal her tears. Then you came, and I understood all of this. You came to free me from the slavery I myself had created, to tell me that I was free to return to the world and to the thing of the world. I understood everything I needed to know, and I love you more than all the women I have ever known, more than I loved the woman who quite unwittingly exiled me to the forest. I will always remember now that love is liberty. That was the lesson it took me so many years to learn. That is a lesson that sent me into exile and now set me free again. The flames crackled in the fire, and a few latecomers were beginning to say their goodbyes, but Brida wasn't listening to anything that was going on around her. Brida, she heard a distant voice call. Here is looking at you, kid, said Magus. It was a line from an old film he had seen once. He felt happy because he had turned another important page in the tradition of the sun. He felt the presence of his teacher, who had chosen that night for his new limitation. I will always remember you, and you will remember me, just as we will Remember the evening, the rain on the windows, and all the things we will always have because we cannot possess them. Brida, Lawrence called again. Go in peace, said the magus, and dry those tears, or tell him that the smoke from the fire got in your eyes. Never forget me. He knew he didn't need to say this, but he said it anyway. Vika noticed that some people had left a few of their belongings behind. She would have to phone them and tell them to come and fetch them. The fire will have burnt down soon, she said. He remained silent. There were still a few flames, and he still had his eyes fixed on them. I don't regret that I once fell in love with you, Vika went on. Nor I do, replied Magus. She felt an enormous desire to talk about Brida, but she said nothing. The eyes of the man beside her inspired respect and wisdom. It is a shame I am not your soulmate, she added. We would have made a good couple. But the Magus wasn't listening to what Vika was saying. There was a vast world before him and many things to do. He had to help plant God's garden. He had to teach people to teach themselves. He would meet other women, fall in love, and live this incarnation as intensely as he could. That night completed one stage of his existence, and a new dark night lay ahead. But the next stage would be much more enjoyable and joyful, much closer to what he had dreamed. He knew this because of the flowers and the forests, and because of young women who arrive one day, led by God's hand, not knowing that they are there in order for destiny to be fulfilled. He knew this because of the tradition of the moon and the tradition of the sun.